Already several years ago, the limits to growth and the mentality of the Club of Rome led to the fact that we really were calling an emergency situation. And when I took over the Club of Rome as president 2 years ago, we came together around this new thinking of really we are in the midst of what we call human fragility and systems fragility. And that we actually have a planet now which is infected by Homo sapiens. The core for us, and the reality check of all of this, is that the greatest existential risk to all of us is clearly the climate risk. The climate risk is having an impact on biodiversity, and biodiversity and climate are having an impact on feedback loops. If we look at then the link now to the health crisis, we can see that COVID actually is zoonotic disease is coming out of our encroachment on the planetary boundaries. So this convergence of tipping points with a real urgency, because we know already now that the 1.5 degree hope coming out of Paris will not be met, that with a heating environment, we will continue to have more zoonotic diseases, we will continue to have more health pandemics, and we will continue to have biodiversity loss, and we will continue to have a series of feedback loops. What we're trying to do through our planetary emergency plan is, one, have as many governments declare that we are in an emergency and understand what an emergency response actually means in practice. And then two, come forward with the key actions that will actually enable us to get to 1.5 degrees, bring in the human dimension that I mentioned before, and ensure that actually we can become more resilient as we face future crises. So you will see that what we focused our attention on was 10 commitments for the global commons first, to try to see whether or not we could actually immediately, by 2030 in this decade of action, put forward some very key laws at the global level that would halt the destruction of our cryosphere, of our Arctic, and also of our permafrost in Siberia, which we're already starting to see now, the combination of glaciers melting and permafrost actually melting, which is having a very destructive impact both on our oceans, but clearly on warming and temperature inversion. But we also want to look at forests. We want to look at the indigenous people within those communities, and how do we actually stop and give back to those people what is rightfully theirs, but stop the destruction so that it doesn't have an impact on the globe at large. And clearly here is a key issue, which is what is a global common. It's a key issue around what is sovereignty, and a key issue in terms of what are the mechanisms in order to enable us to come to some concluding agreement, whether it be debt for nature swaps, whether it be the elimination of sovereign debt for some countries which have become the lungs of the world. But in addition to that, there are also 10 urgent actions that are much more systemic in their approach, and that are looking at, as I indicated, the human dimension, which is the creation of just and equitable societies, but also the transformation of our energy systems, which is absolutely core to the transformative shift that we're going to need to actually meet the crisis at hand and this planetary emergency. Linking that also to our natural resources use and our materials use, and the fact that we need to look at both circularity and a regenerative economy. Now, some will say that these actions and the calls for action, in particular by 2030, are close to impossible. And in many ways, unfortunately, we probably will never reach them. But what they do is they go in the face of leaders who say we do not have the solutions. We do not know exactly where we should start, because each one of these actions has been calculated in terms of impact and in terms of the technology that we know we already have. So key, for example, again, in the area of renewables, is one, that we need to pull out of fossil energy. Two, that we need to ensure that we stop subsidizing and giving perverse subsidies to continued fossil energy. But three, that we shift those resources, that we shift our models of energy use immediately to renewables. and that we triple the investment that we put into renewables. Now, some of you may have seen that the new IEA predictions just recently, and also coming out of IRENA and other areas, are that actually new investment in energy in renewables has surpassed any investment in fossil energy, which is clearly a huge gain. And in particular now with the cost of fossil energy being so low, but also renewables being so low, this creates a real market pressure and an interest for investment. But we are still nowhere. And in particular in developing countries, we're not seeing the shift that we need to see. And what is fascinating is that the Planetary Emergency Plan, which was launched actually in the UN last year, was already taken on board by many leaders across the globe, including the European Commission and Frans Timmermans, who at the time was just about to become the new Vice President of the European Commission. And what is interesting is that already within the Green Deal, there is a convergence of thinking around people, planet, and prosperity. Now, this is prior to any of the recovery discussions that we are having now. In addition to that, there was political buy-in from the three major parties, and obviously the four major parties, including the Greens, with regard to the need to have a real shift in terms of systems thinking and putting in place a large-scale package in order to respond to this convergence. There was also a great new signal of, we have a mandate, we want to go forward, but also a constraint in time. So what von der Leyen did when she launched the European Green Deal was that it was an excellent start to saying, we need to land this, we need to put forward a package, and we need to put policy proposals that actually have meat in them. We need to ensure that there's a governance structure that creates opportunities rather than constraints. And we need to ensure that we have the institutional support and the member state buy-in for success. And of course, bring in our neighbors, such as Switzerland, such as the other EFTA or non-European Union countries who are subscribing to a neighborhood policy with Europe. But the key issue that we still felt was in the European Green Deal was, one, that it was called a Green Deal, because actually we would have preferred that it was called a Green and Social Deal or just a New Deal. And two, that it did not have new indicators to growth, that it was still fundamentally based on GDP growth. So if you actually look at this, however, what we found as we started to criticize is that there became a new EU leadership that was really solidifying itself around the Green Deal idea. The fact that we had a conservative president alongside a liberal socialist and also a Green Party backing was the first of its kind in the history of the European Union. And then in addition, the fact that there was growing buy-in from the EIB, from the Council itself, and from the ECB, which was bringing in some of the financial credence that was absolutely fundamental. And this was actually followed up with a declaration of the European Investment Bank just after, indicating that they would pull out of all new investments in fossil energy. The European Green Deal is a systemic package, and it clearly represents the views that we have had for many, many years, that the only way to start having a proper recovery and strong resilience plan for the European Union and for any region or nation is to have a systemic package that looks at integrated policies and the way in which we can bring in financial mechanisms that will actually enable those policies. So already before COVID, the Club of Rome and economists like Kate Raworth, and even governments like the Scottish government, like the Icelandic government, like the Finnish government, the Welsh government, and the government of New Zealand, had started to look at this much more systemic approach, part of which the European Green Deal demonstrates, but have gone further in looking at how you actually shift economic indicators into new indicators of well-being and indicators that are properly balanced between environmental and human indicators, and that bring in those values over a growth evaluation overall. And the donut in particular was very much focused on the following: the fact that wealth distribution was actually not working, the fact that we had a current failure to meet basic human needs and to ensure dignity, that there was a challenge to meet the needs of all within the planetary boundaries, that we had to ensure that no one fell short of life's essentials. Now, what is quite incredible is that when you look at the donut and the way in which it should be applied, Amsterdam, which was the first city that applied the donut pre-COVID, has come out of COVID one of the most resilient cities. The we-gov governments that I have just mentioned, the ones that have brought in well-being, New Zealand, Iceland, Finland. Now, granted, they're all run by women, but in addition, they all have well-being economies that they're trying to promote, and they came out more resilient post-COVID. So what's interesting here is that even pre-COVID, there was a thinking that was very much stimulated by the limits to growth originally around how can you better create resilience and then recover from shocks to your system. And that these recovery mechanisms need to be ingrained in a new economic model. So if you look at the 750 trillion that is actually being allocated with regard to the recovery, if you look at the way in which now the big debate in the multilateral framework for finance framework at the European level is being debated as we speak, we can see that already there has been some pushback from some of the member states in terms of bailout schemes, in terms of the way in which they see the recovery, which is not actually linked to a green and social recovery, but is much more linked to a continuation of business as usual economics. But at the European level, the aspiration and the debate still now very live in the European Parliament and in the European Commission is around how can we actually look much more at this transformational change that we've seen through COVID and bring in place the health and economic and finance resilience that we need in our systems so that if we have future shocks, and we're already seeing that we will have predominantly a next phase of COVID, and we will also have continued climate and biodiversity shocks, we can be more resilient. How can we actually ensure that we take into consideration technology, governance, and socioeconomic systems, which is why the commissioners and also the president are so wanting to bring digitalization, green and social together. And again, we saw digitalization during COVID being fundamental in terms of not only allowing me to speak to you tonight, but also creating that link between people and their work, or people, kids and their schools, etc. And how do we ensure that we enhance that so that inequality is not the option, and that Europe actually really does move into a deeper systemic change of innovation and renewal? And what we're also seeing is clearly that we cannot deny that we can't just focus on climate change or on the planetary boundaries without bringing in the human dimension. That if we don't focus on livelihoods and lives now and the basic essentials, we will not get very far in terms of systems change. Bringing a value back to what is essential is also very much what now the president has been talking about, also, by the way, in terms of being one of the first who is thinking around making sure that we have access to a vaccine as we move through this recovery process, which is comparable across the region, but also across other countries, working in collaboration and solidarity, rather than taking a very individualistic, nationalistic approach as we see in the United States, in China, in Russia, and in Brazil. So what we're saying is the COVID-19 recovery cannot just give up the European Green Deal. It can't give up its climate objectives, or actually its anchoring around the SDGs, but it has to work towards the transition to really enable a much more resilient Europe. And what does that mean? That means that we do need to have investment criteria attached to the funds. We do need to ensure that actually we've got a taxonomy, or at least a do no significant harm set of principles, which indicate that actually member states are not going back to business as usual, that they're not propping up an old economy. Next week, the president will actually announce on the 16th in our State of the Union address that we will most likely be setting a new target for 2030 of 55% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. That will mean that we will have to totally shift into investing in renewable energy and energy efficiency instead of fossil fuels. And from a Swiss perspective, I'm very much hoping that the finance community in Switzerland in particular will really follow this shift and put their money much more in those types of investments. It also, however, means investing in nature and reforestation. And again, Swiss finance strength is very important here, but also, obviously also the fact that you're an alpine region is also fundamental. Having myself done a trek around the Mont Blanc, I know exactly what is happening, and having a house just on the other side of many of you in France, I have seen over the last 50 years, since I was a very small child, the way in which the Mont Blanc has quickly disintegrated in front of our eyes. And then the investment in sustainable food system and regenerative agriculture. Very important point here, both in terms of, again, ensuring that the finance community stands behind new agricultural projects and new ways of growing food. But you also have very important companies like Nestlé or others that are in Switzerland that are moving in this direction and could be real leaders. But in addition, and having had conversations with some of the local communities in Switzerland, I also know that the cantons are working very hard on looking at new types of agricultural practices and enhancing also permaculture, organic agriculture, and regenerative agriculture. And that brings me to the last point, which is another area where actually Switzerland can be a model, is the importance of its local communities. We know that actually the real shift in mindset is going to come from citizens and local action, but also local authorities who are going to start to push that local action. We've seen in the Paris Agreement and in many of the international agreements that at the end of the day, we are now getting very much a trickle up rather than a trickle down effect, where actually it is the local communities that are really starting to shift rather than just the national. And in fact, in some countries like the United States, it is the states and the local communities that are doing most of the change. And definitely it's not being done at the federal level. So what we've been saying and what we continue to call for at the European level, and we feel at least in the European community, there is a greater appreciation for people, planet, and prosperity being at the center of a deep transformation, and that really economic leadership will really create the resilience that we need post-COVID. That's the discussion that's very live now. It could go either way. I think that in terms of the recovery itself and the European Union, the president and the commissioners and members of parliament are very cognizant of the fact that a lot of this will depend on implementation by the member states, and whether the member states are just going to want to create an incumbent as usual or a back to business as usual framework, or whether they really will be ready to transform and innovate. So I'll leave it at that, and I look forward to your questions.
Now,
so first of all, you may be familiar with, I sit on the taxonomy group. The taxonomy was obviously the new finance criteria that we put together at the European level with regard to evaluating green projects in particular. And there is a huge debate right now that you may be familiar with within the taxonomy, where France and in particular some other countries that are very dependent on nuclear have indicated that within the taxonomy, nuclear should be claimed as a green technology. Now, the reason why actually nuclear for the moment has not been claimed as green within the taxonomy, and I'll come specifically to your question, but this is linked to it, is the question that you've just put, or the claim that you put at the end, which is that it's safe. So the fact of the matter is that when we put together our criteria for the taxonomy, we had to look at both the climate mitigating possibility of the technology, and in that sense, nuclear is definitely climate mitigating. But we also had to look at the 4 other environmental objectives in terms of do no significant harm to land, water, soil, and to human beings. And within that context, we as experts could not assess clearly that there would be no damage. Hence, we did not give a clean bill of health for nuclear within the taxonomy. Now, that was the experts' advice. Has it been listened to at the political level? Yes, partially, but as you know, energy is a big game, and it's a big political game, and it's a big political game as to who owns what supply. So if you are, like Poland, very dependent on coal production, you will continue to fight for coal. If you are like France, very dependent both on nuclear production, but also on the development of nuclear technology, then you will fight for nuclear. So for the moment, there is still an open fight on the taxonomy with regard to nuclear, and it is an open case. The same is for gas. We are having the same, and both are creating an issue for renewables. Because the conversation, obviously, is what is short-term and what is long-term. From a short-term perspective, we immediately need to invest in renewables infrastructure to enable for renewables to come forward, both in terms of storage, intermittency, etc. But if we put too much of our investment in more pipelines, more gas infrastructure, new second generation or even third generation nuclear technologies, then we're not actually shifting now in the short term towards renewables. And so I agree with you that this is a real issue. I have a feeling that's kind of where your question was going. And it is one that is very live. I think that the only way for the renewables industry to really win this is, first of all, the fact that the price has gone down so phenomenally will continue to increase the investment in renewables. But I think also importantly, the renewables industry has to come together as a joint voice. What I saw myself on the European stage was the fact that the solar industry was fighting one war, the wind industry was in another corner, ocean was in tidal, etc. And in addition to that, no one was working with the heating side, which by the way is the big missing link in terms of how we bring in renewables on heating and cooling, rather than just think about power. So I think to come back to this whole point around technologies, there are clearly countries that are picking winners because they have invested interest in those technologies. The problem with nuclear and those technologies is, can we bring them to scale at the necessary time that we need now, which is really this decade of action? And then can we, without a doubt, prove that we will not have the impacts that we know we've had in the past coming from nuclear due to radiation, et cetera. And by the way, I put in place the first environmental management system on a nuclear site in Belgium. So I do think that there is a professional aspect within the nuclear industry. They are trying also to do the right thing. But at the end of the day, we do need to look at the overall impacts that can come from certain industries, products, and practices. So I completely agree with you that, first of all, we need to take that into consideration and then understand that actually there are some parts that unite people You know, the greatest thing about Cambridge Analytica, and by the way, I'm totally against what happened. I often talk about a Cambridge Analytica for good. But what Cambridge Analytica did was that it figured out ways to tap into people's consciousness and manipulate them to a certain sense, and then also figure out how to understand what that manipulation would actually do. And in this case, it was around an election. And the same happened during Brexit, and you know, who knows what's going to happen now with the Trump election, by the way. I think what's interesting is that we were able to see, unfortunately and fortunately, that now with media and social media, we can get a broader group of people around certain issues. The question is, how do we get the right people to do that? And do we need young influencers, for example? So the whole kind of South Korean tapping into some of the Trump speeches, which happened, 6 months ago, was quite phenomenal to think that these were young adults already playing at a very tricky game around how to use social media and understand how to manipulate certain thinking. And we could, there are ways in which we should be thinking, those of us who really believe that we are in the midst of a planetary emergency, as to how we can better use social media to get more people to understand how it touches them, because that's the key. So that was going to be my next point. Where are the touch points where no matter whether you're a populist, whether you're a denialist, whether you're a tree hugger, whatever, brings you together? And that's where COVID has been really interesting. And that's actually a study that we're going to be doing now at the Club of Rome, and I'm trying to push for a movie as well that brings together videos from across the globe, 3-minute snapshots of what do you feel happened during COVID that was different in your life to before, and what do you feel coming out of COVID is essential to you? And if we unpack that, do we really think that a populist or a racist would say, I want to kill a bunch of blacks? Or would they say, the most important thing post-COVID is I want to make sure that I'm safe, that my family's safe, that I have access to food and water? I don't know. This is a question, right? And I think that we as academics, as responsible experts, as enlightened human beings, need to make it our responsibility to figure out what are those touch points and then start to influence them in a proper way, either through community discussions, sectoral discussions, and higher level, obviously, international and national discussions. And we need game changers and influencers in each of those. And we need to come out with those right touch points. So I still believe that actually, if you really want to bring together people, you have to hit them where they feel the most hit. That is my feeling. So yes, a lot can happen at the community level, but I do think that it also has to be a concerted strategy in terms of education, knowledge exchange, and using the tools that we have before us. And I think one of the learnings that we have at the Club of Rome, and also we compare history to now, is we are in a totally, totally different age. We cannot sit in ivory towers of intellectuals coming out with publications. First of all, most people don't read publications anymore or books. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't, at least in particular, the masses of people. And those are the people that we need to convince so that they elect the right leaders and that we bring the right people into power so that we can make the right decisions. It is the question. You're absolutely right. And how can you do it also in an economic downturn? So I would have a double whammy is what we're faced with, because already it's an incredibly complex question. And then it becomes even more complex when people are struggling. And so I think that the only answer so far that I have found to your question is that we have to start with very smart, short-term, big levers that will start to make a change. again, there are members in the Club of Rome who believe that we should go out for the full bang right now, exactly as you have described, which is really say, okay, stop producing cars. We stop all of our economic production over consumption focus, and we really focus on local, on creating the least damage possible. And I think that overall, we will get there, because unfortunately Armageddon is going to hit us, and unfortunately human beings don't actually really change until they're fearful or they have to. But I do think that in the meantime, there's a lot that can be done to tap into this moment of time. The European Green Deal, and in fact, I'm sitting on a report right now that we presented to von der Leyen between the Club of Rome and Systemic, which is a management consultancy that I also work with, that you may be familiar with as an ambassador. We're producing a compass that talks about the need for a new systems approach to the European Green Deal that would enable it to actually truly be systemic and start to move away from growth as the prerequisite for economic development. And we've heard back from the president that actually she was very interested in our report, and we will have now a series of different meetings. I think that I don't think we would get as far 10 years ago as we may get now, because of this convergence of tipping points, because of the fact that we now are in economic difficulty, and Europe also needs to find a new innovative path. But I do think it's going to be incredibly difficult to pull all of this out of the bag at the same time when people have lost lives and livelihoods. And so I think we need to get better at showing what a degrowth vision really looks like for people, rather than indicating that it's all about sacrifice and a decrease in their livelihoods or their lives. And the way to do that also, by the way, and I'll finish with that, and I may be wrong, but I think we need to start being honest about what does the economy really give us right now? And where did we see, again, the failings in the focus of some of the policies on pure consumption, growth, and prosperity for the few rather than the many? And we can take the United States as a perfect example. And I grew up in Palo Alto. I'm French-Belgian, by the way, but I have a very strong accent that I cannot get rid of. And that is that in Palo Alto and San Francisco, when I grew up, there was not this incredible distinction between the haves and the have-nots. Now, Palo Alto and California and the United States in particular have the highest discrepancy between the haves and the have-nots. We have the highest rate of homelessness. In San Francisco right now, we have so many homeless people that people are leaving, fleeing, because people are going to the bathroom in the middle of the street, and we have heroin addicts all over the place. This is the reality. I'm not being dramatic. I'm being real. Now, can we not show that image to most people and say, is that what you want? Is that what really brings you happiness? Can we not talk about the fact that we have the highest suicide rate that we've ever seen in humanity? The highest level of depressions amongst young people and breakdowns? Now, if that is the type of society that people think GDP growth and our focus only on profit for the few and not for the many is, then maybe we can change them to something else and to support something else. So that would be one way for me to start saying, this is the way to humanize where we want to go, to say, actually, the future can be brighter. So you may not own 4 cars or 3 cars or even 1 car, but you will still be able to get to where you need to go. You will still have a roof over your head. You will be healthier. You will be happier. And isn't that a better aspiration than what we now have?